Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is shaping up to be one of my favorite games of all time. It captures the look and feel of the Indiana Jones films, and its rendering makeup plays a large part in that. So when I heard back in August that this game was getting the full ray tracing treatment, I was rather excited. And seeing the results this week with the launch of the full version of the game has been spectacular. The full ray tracing in Indiana Jones takes an already great looking game and elevates it up to new levels, often bridging the gap to offline rendering. It's incredible to look at. And in today's video, I will go over the full ray tracing implementation in Indiana Jones, talking about its various subcomponents, its current limitations, and also talk about performance for those who want to try it out. So grab a seat and lean back as I take you through the full ray tracing implementation in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. There are indeed many areas in Indiana Jones's rendering makeup which are rather massively improved by turning on the various pieces of technology which power the game's current implementation of full ray tracing. One of the most needed improvements is to the game's shadows, and very specifically, the directional cascaded shadow maps from the sun or moon. As I mentioned in my last video on the game, moving forward or backward through the game world often shows big visual discontinuities in the game's shadow map rendering from the sun. It flips between a kind of mediocre resolution to an ultra low resolution at a distance that is surprisingly close to the camera, and it visually pops, so it is distracting, and the resolution up close for the closest cascade is just not enough to actually showcase the game's rich geometric quality. The full RT option here comes replete with a ray traced sun shadows option, which replaces the game's aforementioned cascaded shadow maps, and it greatly enhances the shadow quality, realism, and detail. The popping shadow cascade behavior, for example, is completely eliminated, so moving backward or forward through the game world, as we see in the side by side here, no longer shows off that awkward effect. This is expected of ray trace shadows, but it is greatly appreciated here due to how obvious the cascade difference is. Beyond that, ray trace shadows also greatly reduce aliased noise in the shadows up close to the camera. And this is most often easily seen, for example, in the game's jungle sections where tree canopies above the player have tons of fine leaf detail that the lower res shadow map just cannot resolve. So the changing detail per frame pops in and out of existence in the shadow map, causing bad aliasing. Switching over to ray trace shadows, all of the leaves and branches above are captured in full soft shadow detail, with none of the awkward aliasing and popping which is found in the base game. It looks a lot better, I would say. As with other RT shadow implementations, it also means you get a penumbra effect on the shadows, where shadows closer to the caster are sharper than those further away. Take the shadow from the moon found in this level. With RT off, this shadow from the roof behind the camera is universally sharp. With RT on, we can actually see its two roofs in the shadow. One roof is further away and one is closer. This effect really enhances the realism in many scenes, often giving faraway trees, for example, a dappled lighting look that the base game just cannot even represent. The last area where RT sun shadows help is with small detail. The game does have a lot of high quality geometry, as I mentioned earlier, scattered about the levels, and the RT shadows here help you see that detail in the geometry better. Often objects can just be excluded from the shadow map pass, or they're just far too small for the shadow map to resolve their detail properly. RT sun shadows here are done on a per pixel basis, giving each and every rivet, blade of grass, or tiny little trinket found on the ground perfectly sharp and accurate self shadows. At times the difference is dramatic, and it definitely increases the game's apparent object detail and materials up close. next upgrade is a smaller one in glass rendering. In the base game, glass reflections are wholly rendered via static cube maps. When you get closer to them, as often happens in the game, it's easy to see how low resolution they are, and generally misaligned they are with the actual world geometry. This leads to reflections lacking proper perspective and dynamism. When you flip on the full RT option, which handles reflections, that gives all the glass surfaces in the game sharp, ray-traced reflections, which gets rid of the awkward, low-res, and improperly placed cube map reflections on that glass. And furthermore, the things rendered in the reflection can now move, as they should. So the world looks a lot more alive in comparison in those areas where glass shows up. It has a new sheen, literally. There's not too much glass scattered across Dr. Jones's world-trotting adventure, but it's there often enough for it to be an appreciated upgrade over the game's base cube map system. Perhaps the largest upgrade to the game's visuals in total comes from the change to indirect lighting, both diffuse indirect lighting and specular indirect lighting. Specular indirect lighting, in common parlance, means reflections, both glossy and rough reflections. And diffuse lighting means the light that bounces around a scene to brighten up dark areas. Here, a combination of systems are fully replaced with a path-traced indirect lighting solution, which uses multiple bounces and has a system for caching results to accumulate even more bounces. Let me first start with the reflections. The base game here uses a combination of SSR, cube maps, as well as a little bit of contribution from the game's ray trace GI, and a number of hand-placed cinematic light sources to get reflection effects in the game. SSR and cube maps, though, are responsible for the bulk of reflections, and they have limitations like we see in many other titles. But in id Tech, the standard SSR also has some other limitations. It only shows perfectly sharp reflections no matter the surface type. This is presumably done for performance reasons. The game does have to run at 60 FPS on consoles after all. If you replace these type of reflections with multi-bounced ray-traced ones, it can have a dramatic effect on the quality of the game's objects and materials. Take this rather mundane looking example with full RT off. Here, Indiana Jones is holding a spade in front of a worn glass window in a Vatican piazza. The game, with its base system for reflections, leaves a lot to be desired here. If you look at the materials, the wood of the handle, the metal of the shovel itself, the glass windows, and the brick, it's actually hard to differentiate the materials on them, as they're all being shaded in a very approximate way, which makes all the different materials here actually look really similar to one another. All the surfaces in this shot look very diffuse and rough, and things don't look as they are. They may have different base colors, but the shading on their surface is almost the same across every single material. This is a classic video game problem where SSR and cube maps just can't handle different types of materials in challenging lighting conditions. If we flip over to the full RT render, we can see a large difference where all the different materials are now distinguishing themselves. Looking at the wall, we can see that the brick now looks very different from the window surface. The window is now reflecting the sunlit square behind the camera, and even Indiana Jones shows up in that reflection. And there's different levels of roughness of that reflection based upon where the scuffs are on the window. The brick in comparison only has the smallest hints of reflection, as it is old worn brick. If you look over at the spade, we can actually call a spade now. The wood looks wholly different than the metal of the shovel. Side by side, I think it's easy to see how materials like metal, wood, glass, and brick are now much more identifiably distinct than they were before. They all look uniformly rough before without full RT on, whereas with full RT on, some materials shine, some shine a bit, and some barely shine at all. Going throughout the game, there are just now many materials in different scenes which show off reflections that were otherwise not able to be accurately rendered before. Polished hardwood floors now look a lot more like the real deal, showing very subtle reflections of bright light sources, like the sky. Same with marble, which kind of looked okay at grazing angles before, but when you looked at it full on, SSR just doesn't work at all, so they would become matte depending upon which angle you look at them. Full RT's perspective correct reflections alleviate that issue completely, so marble looks like marble no matter how you look at it. Another interesting change is for metals in general. Due to SSR only working in screen space and QMaps being very rough, the game's metal surfaces tend to look shallow and dark. All the glorious artifacts that Indy comes across can look a bit dull on inspection, as they do not reflect themselves and the things nearby. With full RT, metal objects now are going to reflect themselves and nearby objects, so brass, silver, and gold look much more visually distinct, whereas before they all looked kind of generically, dully reflective and with a lot of darkness in the reflections. A big contributing factor to this is that there are now at least 2 reflection bounces comprising reflections, leading to some interesting visuals. For example, here, all the metal relics have this kind of samey shine on them from the QMaps and SSR and direct lights, and they are surprisingly dark for being made of metal. They're just not reflecting correctly. Pop on full RT and there's a world of difference here with how the metals look. For one, the detail on them is a lot brighter and distinct as it's now reflecting the world and objects around them. Silver looks more like silver, gold like gold, and brass like brass. Looking at the polished metal mirror here behind all the objects, we can see how the multiple reflection bounces work in action. With full RT off, this polished metal mirror here looks more like a black void, while with full RT on, we can see the polished metal mirror now reflecting the back of the golden vase in front of it. And on the surface of that vase, in the reflection, we can see it reflecting other things, like lights and objects nearby. Reflections in reflections are pretty key to the realism of materials in scenes like this, where there's a lot of reflective surfaces that are very close to one another. If I flick back and forth, I think it just shows off how much better the game can look for materials like this. The multi-bounce reflections from the indirect lighting in this game really aid the game's visuals by pushing some of those more mundane looking scenes with video gamey looking materials to looking quite spectacular in comparison. To describe the differences in diffuse lighting, it helps to describe the base RTGI system the game ships with that path tracing replaces. The base RTGI in the game is based around a grid of probes that is extended from the camera origin. These probes are then traced by sending out rays from the probe's perspective into the world around them, and the world is then lit up by using the lighting information from each of these probes. So it's not really per pixel RTGI in this sense, so it is not always very precise enough to capture all the local lighting detail. A great example is here on this door frame in a dark hallway. This is with the full RT off. Here the probes making up the grid of probes around the camera are intersecting poorly with the door, so sunlight bouncing around the room adjacent is leaking through the opposite side of the wall near the door frame. It has the effect of making the wall on the right here look like it's floating above the ground. This is usually a typical rasterization issue, but it happens pretty much in any case when things are not done in a per pixel manner, even with ray tracing. Turning on the path traced indirect lighting, you can see that the lighting is no longer misaligned, leaking through the wall on the opposite side, as the lighting is evaluated per pixel. In a side-by-side, it looks quite different, I would say, with one looking quite a bit better than the other. Preventing light from leaking through objects and walls is a big plus from the path-traced indirect lighting versus the probe-based ray tracing that the game otherwise uses for its global illumination. Light leak doesn't just happen through walls, but it can also happen through objects themselves. Take this broken display case on the floor here. The combination of probes and lacking reflections makes it look like the debris is floating above a very bright wooden ground. That looks somewhat video gamey to me. If we turn on the full RT, that effect is completely avoided with the object now atop the floor, which is darkened in all those places where it ought to be darkened. Another area where you can see a big difference in this aspect is in the jungle. The probes do an okay job here, stopping the light from spilling through the canopy above, but they are not great at stopping the light from leaking through the plants themselves. With full RT on though, each and every plant's geometry is seemingly added to the BVH structure which is being traced against here. And that means plants obscure the light bouncing off of each other. And this leads to much more intense darkening in the areas where the undergrowth is thickest. Along with looking just more natural in general, it increases the contrast in all the scenes in the jungle, making them look less washed out, which they could potentially look before. This is especially apparent if you compare the PC version to the Xbox Series X, which had even less objects being traced against than the PC version. With full RT on versus Xbox Series X, the game looks honestly generationally different in the jungle scenes, and perhaps that can whet people's appetites for the PlayStation 6 and Xbox Next. So light is much more realistically obscured with path tracing, and there's a lot less light leaking through objects, which will make the image look less washed out, and objects just don't look like they're floating anymore or glowing in those areas where they should rather be dark. Another thing that the path-traced indirect lighting improves is lighting locality. With the game's base RTGI using probes, which are just points in space that gather lighting information to apply to nearby objects, it can commonly not be fine-grained enough to capture smaller bounces of light. Like here, as I look at this sliver of sunlight hitting these boxes. With the probe-based RTGI, there's some nice shadowing going on here, but the sunlight hitting the boxes is just not bouncing much around the scene. If you turn on the path trace lighting, we can see a new layer of yellow glow that splashes around those boxes. Without that, the scene looks much more clinical and gray. Same with the shot of the record player. The light from the window outside and the sunlight is kind of well obscured from the window with the base RTGI, but if you flip on the path tracing, you can see how much more local bounce is being added into the image. You get an added orange glow on the wall behind the gramophone. There's the bounce of white light off of the white curtains. And there's a lot of smaller bits of light around the windowsill. This is what happens in many scenes of the game. Scenes that looked good before get enhanced local global illumination effects, typically brightening up areas that were more gray before, with a tinge of the light bouncing off of a nearby surface. And it is especially evident in those areas lit by bright lights, such as the sun. This effect, though, can be seen with indoor lights too, of course, where the probe system there can bounce light around a room in a sufficient manner, but it often doesn't bounce the light around nearly enough. This often causes ceilings to be a lot darker than they ought to be. Another thing that the probe-based RTGI has a tendency to do is to over-average the lighting color and contribution to a scene. For example, here we're under this red tent with the full RT being off, and the probe-based RTGI is bouncing light around underneath this tent, but its average color is a bit gray. Flip on the full RT and we get a lot more of the red locally from the light bouncing off the red cloth above. It looks quite nice. Or check out this hallway here. The probes here are doing an okay job of capturing that light from coming outside the window, but it is over-averaging the color of the sky, the sun, and the yellow leaves outside and making it a rather neutral gray light. Flip on full RT, and the color temperature is more amber in tone, and all of the light leaking through the walls is of course cleaned up as well too. Altogether, when you combine the effects of the various subcomponents of this full RT system in Indiana Jones, it can lead to some dramatically different looking scenes. And honestly, this video cannot detail it in total, as the experience of moving around the world with the heightened consistency in lighting is a treat unto itself with many surprises. Seriously, while walking around this world, I actually got hungry once while looking at this ray-traced cornetto here. Things now just don't look as out of place as they could have before. They don't look wrongly shaded or washed out, and no matter where the camera goes, the lighting will tend to keep up. The full RT in Indiana Jones is an awesome upgrade that greatly enhances the already meticulously detailed world found in the base game. So as I've shown, the game does look a great deal better nearly everywhere. But not everything is fully better with the full RT implementation here, as it's not to the same level as we've seen in other games such as Alan Wake 2 or Cyberpunk 2077. Some areas will have much smaller differences because there's still some leftover rasterization here, and some of it's unexpected. Shadows and direct lighting not from the sun, for example, will still be rasterized and use shadow maps. That means if you go in indoor areas, you can often see shadow map acne and issues that you would also find in the base game. So So shadows will show popping level of detail there, light can leak through objects that are not properly accounted for, and you'll even see some non-shadow casting lights. Indiana Jones does not seem to be using RTX DI or Restor direct lighting at the moment, so you'll still see a number of lighting issues due to the raster path of lighting there. Another thing you will notice is how bodies of water still use SSR. Yep. No RT reflections here, oddly. It's something that seemingly did not make the release window. And there are a few other oversights I have found while playing the game rather thoroughly. Dr. Jones, where's your hair? Yeah, in Reflections, Indiana Jones looks a bit more like Agent 47 at the moment, as his hair is not being ray traced against. And the hair that is in the game, like the hair on Dr. Jones's hands here, is seemingly lit and shadowed by the based shadow map pass. So for example, here I'm in shadow, and the hair on Indy's hand is glowing oddly here. It's white and strange looking. You can see why this is happening when you turn off full RT. In the non-full RT version, you can see that the shadow map actually has Indy's hand here being lit by the sun. So it would seem like some transparencies, such as hair, can perhaps be mismatched with the ray traced lighting results at times. The last oversight I found is that the cloth in the game does not seem to have the light permeate it to the other side. So like here in this tent in Giza, with the path tracing off, we can see that the shadows from the things outside the tent are visible inside the wall of the tent. So it looks like light is permeating through. That's just not there with the path tracing on. And you can see this in the game's tents in Giza or in the drapes in the palaces of the Vatican. Here I think we're looking at an oversight and not a technical limitation, as the vegetation for the game does show lighting and shadow transmission perfectly with path tracing on. So if you look at the bottom side of a leaf, you can see the shadows and light permeating it with real subsurface scattering to the other side. So the effect is totally technically possible, but it seems like it is not being applied to certain materials at the moment that should potentially have it. The biggest incomplete aspect of the full RT at the moment comes from the lack of DLSS ray reconstruction. The game is currently using NVIDIA's NRD at the moment when full RT is set to on. It is fine, but it has issues. Reflections can be a bit laggy in movement and a bit smeary. Reflections in Reflections can be unstable, like the polished metal mirror I showed off earlier. That shows a swimming effect if you look at the reflections in the reflections there. And if you look at some of the rougher reflections, they can at times be eliminating surface normal detail, and I'm pretty sure more of that should be cutting through the reflection sheen. In general, the game still looks fine, of course, but I'm pretty sure ray reconstruction would do a much better job here than what we see at the moment. Could potentially even be cheaper on the GPU depending upon what's on screen if Cyberpunk is any indication. That should be coming in the future as far as I know, but if you do find some of the negative points I've listed here to be a deal breaker, I would definitely advise you to wait for future patches of Indiana Jones before you dive into the game using this full RT setting. Given the concessions to the full RT implementation that I just talked about, it is actually a decidedly lighter game on your GPU than Alan Wake 2 or Cyberpunk 2077, which have similar technologies. As an example, nearly all of the B-roll in this footage was captured at 4K DLSS quality mode, maxed out with full RT on its highest settings at a very consistent 60 FPS minimum on an RTX 4090 with no frame generation. Such a thing is completely impossible in the other games with full RT like Alan Wake 2. The only exception to the performance in this game is those places in the jungle. There, to maintain 60 FPS on the RTX 4090, I did have to drop down to DLSS in performance mode. Tracing against leaves and whatnot is really expensive in general. The RTX 4090 though is at the ultra top end and not relevant to most users, but something like an RTX 4070 is, and to get the full RT features running there is definitely a challenge. First, you have VRAM. The game will not even show the full RT option at all if you have below 12 GB of VRAM. And based on my experience and what I heard directly from the devs, it makes a lot of sense, as GPUs with less memory just could not possibly load in the RT structure for many levels. And even on a 12 GB GPU, concessions have to be made. In my last video, I showed off that you can essentially use the Supreme Texture Cache setting at 1440p DLAA on a 4070 without the full RT option on. That is definitely not the case with the full RT option on, which adds a lot more information into the VRAM to be ray traced against. There, even on the ultra texture cache setting with full RT, VRAM will be completely overfilled and the frame rate will be abysmally low. To get proper frame rate on an RTX 4070, you will have to use the texture cache setting set to either high or medium depending upon the ambient VRAM that Windows is using. Even then, with the texture cache concessions in place, it is obvious that at 1440p with DLAA, the 4070 would not cut it for a 60 FPS experience, not by a long shot. With the full RT options on max, it is typically in the 30s or 40s in just the less demanding areas of the game, not even the jungle. Even with DLSS in performance mode at 1440p, the RTX 4070 maxed out as I just showed is barely hitting 60 FPS in the lightest scenes in the game, and as soon as you go to the jungle, yeah, it's gonna be in the 40s. Given how we're using DLSS performance mode here at 1440p and there is no ray reconstruction, image quality takes a rather huge hit, and I don't think it is frankly worth it to play the game like this, even with maxed out settings. There's just too much resolution and frame rate sacrifice here. So for a mid-range GPU like the 4070, you will want to turn down some settings. I have found out that the sweet spot for settings on a card like this is to use the lowest full RT setting or just the one above it. On the lowest RT setting, which technically is only RT sun shadows, it is still a big visual win because the sun shadows look so much better, and you also get more objects added to the BVH structure, which augments the game's default RTGI, giving it a quality boost, decreasing its light leaking and adding in much more natural occlusion. Above that, if you go to the setting that adds in single bounce RT reflections, you'll see an even greater improvement to indirect lighting quality and the quality of things like metals. That might be a good setting for something like an RTX 4070 Super. For an RTX 4070 though, I think DLSS with quality, with just the RT sun shadows, is actually an awesome experience. At worst in the jungle, it'll be down in the 50s, but it'll have much higher FPS in lighter scenes with generally really great image quality, I would say, given what we're looking at here. Now before I close out this video, I want to talk about one last thing, and that is the cutscene animation issues. As of the day one patch, they're still there, even though patch notes mention it being remedied. In numerous cutscenes in the Vatican and many thereafter, there were still tons of sequences that had animations playing with 30 FPS. They look really bad, honestly, and I really think the devs still need to look into that and fixing it. But beyond that, I hope you enjoyed this video detailing the full RT system in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Hopefully getting some patches to clean some stuff up, but generally in a pretty okay state at the moment and looking really great. So if you did like this video, hit that like button, subscribe, support on Patreon, follow on Blue Sky, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.